And I am sure that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion in the day of Christ Jesus. Is not Advent a time of imagination and wonder? We imagine what it was like when Jesus first came. The darkness of Israel enslaved under Roman rule. The growing hope that prophecies would soon be fulfilled. The hope of the world encountered in a manger. We also imagine what it will be like when he comes again. The darkness of our current world dispersed, every tear wiped away, hope fulfilled anew. And we imagine what it would be like when we meet Jesus. If my heart were fully pure, my life with no attachments to venial sin, heroically making Christ known to others, even as he is known by me, if I only had the courage. This is the coming of Jesus that we long for in Advent. And it brings us to our verse today from Philippians. He who began a good work in you will see it through to completion. This takes imagination. You can know the good work that God has already done, and you can know the work is not yet complete. But it takes imagination to see it brought forward to completion and to believe. At this point, I think a good definition of imagination becomes clear. It begins with something we do know, and it projects forward to something that we have not yet received. Like a projector on a screen. If you put a piece of paper right before a projector, the image is too small. You can't appreciate it. But when it goes forward onto a screen, it becomes immersive. That's what imagination does for us. So don't dismiss imagination as merely make-believe. When a boy plays army in the backyard, he is projecting courage. And that enables him to live out courage later. When our girls play orphans, as they all seem to do, they're preparing for themselves to find good, even if the worst thing were to happen. These children understand virtue, which is true and good, and they are appropriating it through imagination. We can learn from them. Delusion is something different. Delusion is destructive, but imagination is productive. Biblical imagination is when we take a promise or a revelation or a virtue from God, no matter how nascent and undeveloped it may be, and we can project our mind's eye forward to a fulfillment yet unseen. And when this happens, the only reasonable response is wonder. Imagination and wonder become the building blocks of faith. Advent is a season in which anticipation in the symbolism, the lights of an Advent wreath shining in darkness, when wonder is cultivated all the more. So once again, St. Paul says, he who began a good work in you will see it through to completion. He is calling us to imagine this. He was writing first to the Philippian church, knowing that persecution would be around the corner for them, even as he already experienced it in jail. This applies, of course, to the broader church throughout the world, expanding throughout the ages, and it applies to you and me as individual members of that church. So what is the good work to which Paul refers? That good work that was begun in us is the cross and the resurrection, the basis of our baptism. It is bringing the kingdom fulfillment of this reality more and more to bear fruit in the world. It is not yet complete in our lives. It is a seed of the church at the time of Paul's writing, and now 2,000 years later, we still haven't seen the fulfillment in the world. The fulfillment will include, St. Paul says, desire, because his prayer for the Philippians is that their desire will be conformed more and more to this fulfillment. And that means making choices that are consistent with the hope that is in you and me. The cross, of course, is a kind of completion. Jesus said, "It is finished." This is what previous generations longed to see, as St. Peter says. You have received what all the previous generations of believers longed to be revealed. And so that means that this good work that was begun in you and me was planted, the seed was planted in Revelation at the very beginning. The Advent season recalls the history of Israel up to the promised Messiah. Many of us experience this through the Jesse tree tradition in our homes. When, if you do this, if not, then I commend this tradition to you. The Jesse tree, you add an ornament to a small tree as you read the history of redemption from the very beginning in the garden up until Christ, one day at a time. And so, after creation, there is, of course, the fall. Our first parents defied God and ate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. St. Ephrem the Syrian in the 4th century wrote that they did this, why? Because of a lack of wonder. They were greedy for knowledge, he says, because Adam refused to imagine what God would do for them if they simply trusted in the promise that was to come. And so enters the darkness of our world that our imagination now is overcoming. All that changed, those wrong choices changed with Abraham. Sophia Cavalletti, who imagined the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd that forms our children today, she asked, what is the source of Abraham's faith? Hebrews 11 says that he left for a promised land, trusting in the promise even though he would never fully receive it in his lifetime. He was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, believing that somehow God would give Isaac back. But then Sophia Cavalletti explains what is the true indication of Abraham's faith. She says, he was the one who could wonder at the stars and laugh with God. God told Abraham, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Of course, no one can count the stars. Have you ever seen the stars, by the way, far away from city lights? I mean, really far away. The Milky Way is like a cloud, so dense the stars are. That's how Abraham would have seen them. This promise requires imagination. Abraham believed the promise and wondered at it. No, he would never see the promise come to completion, but God said the beginning of God's good work would be done in him through a son given to his elderly wife, Sarah. At this proclamation, Abraham laughed in wonder that God would do such a thing. His son named Isaac means he laughs. It is a name from one who can wonder with joy about the completion of God's promise. Sophia Cavalletti says, this particularity of wonder is that we find activity and contemplation inseparably blended within it. I'll say that again. The particularity of wonder is that we find activity and contemplation inseparably blended within it. Activity and contemplation together. Can you imagine that? It is because Abraham's wonder, because of his wonder, that he was able to walk with God in an unknown land. He could imagine the fulfillment before it was given, so that this contemplation fueled his life of faith. Then Cavalletti continues. Wonder is a very serious thing that, rather than leading us away from reality, can arise only from an attentive observation of reality. An education to wonder, she says, is one that helps us go always deeper into reality. We wonder at the work that God has already done within us, which Cavalletti here calls reality. And this transforms our desires so that we can pursue reality of God more vigorously. God, in turn, brings to completion the work he began in us, the education of our very souls. So someone says, well, all right, Father, that fits with the Bible, which is oriented toward God. But what about people who don't begin with biblical revelation? Well, consider that even Aristotle came to the same conclusion. He said, quoting directly from his Metaphysics, "It is owing to their wonder that men both begin and first began to philosophize." By observing the universe, Aristotle presupposed an overarching order. From this, he was able to reason empirically from the bottom up in such a way that he knew each part belonged to a whole. He referred to the mythology of his day as being born out of wonder. So someone asks, where is the meaning of myths? I mean, now, isn't that make-believe just on a grander scale? But Aristotle didn't consider the moral framework of myths to be at odds with his rational philosophy. Both myths and philosophy were born out of the conviction that the universe has meaning. The wonder of a universe with meaning, waiting to be more understood, moves the observer to seek truth. More on myths in a moment. But first, a word about World War I. So put a place marker there about myths. Now, Aristotle and a universe with meaning. That might seem like a given to churchgoers, especially the youth present. But in the late 19th century, until World War I, there was a prevalent idea, even among the non-religious, that history was moving forward toward unending progress. There was a meaning to it all. Diseases were being cured, working conditions were improving, war would be no longer necessary. Until that was wrong. C.S. Lewis fought in that war. The horror and the senseless death that he saw led him to the conclusion that any God who allowed that must not exist. And he wasn't alone. A new modernism became prevalent that insisted that there was no meaning to the universe. This built on the doubt sowed 300 years earlier through Descartes and then Nietzsche, leading to the insistence that truth must be proved in order to be believed. And these thinkers had no imagination, no wonder. We don't have time to cover the movements that followed. the waters, in many ways, in which we now swim. Nihilism, deconstructionism. To the modern mind, World War I was proof that the world was meaningless. And wonder was a lost cause. You've seen the famous artwork of a urinal placed on a table. That's called art because it was a way to make this point clear. There is no meaning. It's only what we call it. But God had begun a work in C.S. Lewis many years before. How could it come to completion if wonder and imagination must lead the way, if C.S. Lewis had given up on it? Lewis recalled, famously, the joy he experienced as a child at play. That joy led to a wonder that he now only experienced, at that time, in reading mythology. But in his mind, mythology led him to an order that he thought was beyond this world. It was an escape from this world. He didn't see any connection to reality. So, how that work was completed in him, let me just share a little story. C.S. Lewis famously struck up a friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien, built on their shared love of mythology. Tolkien was Catholic, but Lewis couldn't share Tolkien's faith. Some of you may know that Tolkien's Catholic faith inspired his imagination. This is what enabled him to write The Lord of the Rings. But C.S. Lewis's imagination at that time had hit a wall, especially when he considered Jesus Christ, because he wondered aloud to Tolkien in a fateful conversation one night in Oxford, how could the death of Jesus lead to salvation for all mankind? It was just too abstract for him. But then later on, C.S. Lewis, in writing to a friend, described how that conversation brought him around full circle to the joy of his youth. He explained that he was moved by the idea of a dying and reviving God as appears in various myths. Balder, Adonis, Bacchus. But he said the meaning of this was always beyond his grasp. And Lewis later wrote how Tolkien convinced him to see the connection between myths and the cross. His direct words. Now, the story of Christ is simply, he said, a true myth. This is what he came to realize talking to Tolkien. It is a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are merely men's myths. The pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets. They're grasping for something in their heart that they know, that long to be revealed, using images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. The story that myths tried to tell finally took place in history. Suddenly, the wonder that Lewis experienced in myth became a wonder grounded in reality. And based on this reality, he could project ahead to hope for the world, even hope for his own soul. This is the power of imagination illumined by the story of the gospel. The good work that began in Lewis through childhood joy became something that God began to move to completion. Jesus, of course, was the source of joy, the meaning of all creation. He was the redemption and the perfection to which all beauty ultimately pointed. Jesus was the meaning of all creation who came down to earth and beckons us further. And so, Lewis could write the Chronicles of Narnia, which, alongside Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, enkindles imaginations the world over. Advent, likewise, enables us to be like children again, alive with anticipation as a symbolism, like Middle-earth, rouses our imaginations and wonder at the coming Lord. Now, before I conclude, we must briefly consider the fact that the work that was begun in the world is still not complete, even though the true myth of the cross has been revealed. And we must come full circle to the fact that the work that was begun in you and me still leaves a longing. Are we ready to meet Christ, as St. Paul prays for the Philippian believers? To this end, I will leave you with the Russian saint, Saint Sophrony. He too, like Lewis, experienced the First World War and said that the tragedy he saw undid anything he read in books. But Christ, he said, despite his suffering, in him there is no tragedy. Through the cross, quoting Sophrony, he lived the tragedy of all mankind, but in himself, no, there is no tragedy. And this is obvious from the words he spoke to the disciples only a short while before the cross. In the world you should have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. But then Sophrony asks, how can we be of good cheer when God's work in us is yet incomplete? He said, conscious that the process of transforming our whole earthly being is far from complete, our spirit wearies. However, he continues, the Holy Spirit convinces the soul that she will not die. Death will not possess her. But how does the Spirit convince us? I heard Tim Keller explain it this past week. He said, it's through our imagination. Imagination enkindled when we worship, when we praise, when we sing and immerse ourselves in the beauty that can come from God alone. Then we can wonder at the goodness of God. We take joy in the one who entered our world to walk with us. And then our imagination prepares us to walk courageously with him until we are complete in the day of Christ.